Jodie Sweetin says her last drink was in 2011, and her latest interview has revealed that one of the people who understood that journey was someone viewers have known as part of her television family for nearly 4 decades, John Stamos. But this is not simply a story about two former costars who stopped drinking. It is about how their support appears to have moved in both directions, how a public ceremony in 2019 exposed part of that private bond, and why Sweetin is discussing it again now. In an interview released July 15, 2026, Sweetin described the connection she and Stamos developed through their respective experiences with sobriety. The important clarification is that she was not announcing a relapse, hospitalization, intervention, or new personal crisis. The update is a reflective one. She was explaining how a relationship that began on a television set eventually became a source of understanding during a far more personal chapter of their lives. For verified entertainment updates without the rumors, subscribe to Startline Entertainment. Sweetin told interviewer Dory that she and Stamos had connected in significant ways over being sober. She said they had celebrated each other's achievements and recovery milestones, and she pointed to a principle she called attraction rather than promotion. In her explanation, recovery is not something she believes should be forced on another person. Instead, she described trying to let the results of her own work become visible to anyone who might be searching for another way forward. That distinction matters because the newest headline could easily be misunderstood. Sweetin was not claiming responsibility for every decision Stamos made, and she did not disclose private conversations or describe one dramatic intervention that changed everything. What she confirmed was a continuing relationship in which two people with different histories recognized something familiar in each other and were present for important moments. Their connection began long before either of them publicly discussed recovery. Sweetin was a child when she joined Full House as Stephanie Tanner, while Stamos played Jesse Katsopoulos, the character she knew as Uncle Jesse. The original series ran from 1987 through 1995. Decades later, they returned for Fuller House, which ran for 5 seasons from 2016 through 2020. Their public association was built around a fictional family, but the recovery story developed outside that fiction and across a much longer timeline. Sweetin has said her struggles with alcohol and drugs developed after the original series ended. She documented much of that period in her memoir, Unsweetined, first published in 2009. The book described the instability behind her public image and the difficult process of trying to rebuild her life. In 2025, Simon & Schuster released an audiobook edition narrated by Sweetin, including a new introduction reflecting on the growth and changes that followed the original publication. Her public sobriety timeline needs to be described carefully because previous articles have sometimes used different starting points. Some summaries have referred to 2008 as the year she initially became sober. Sweetin has also publicly discussed drinking again and experiencing a separate medication relapse connected to treatment after a car accident. In the newest interview, she gave the clearest statement about alcohol itself. 2011 was my last drink. That is the safest current wording because it comes directly from Sweetin and does not combine separate periods of recovery into one simplified date. She said the years since then have involved 12-step work, other programs, therapy, maturity, and a changing perspective on herself. Her focus in the interview was not only abstaining from destructive behavior. She described learning to value the person she had become, suggesting that returning to old patterns became less appealing once she felt protective of the life and identity she had built. That message connects with what Sweetin has said in other recent interviews. In February 2025, she discussed turning her experience into work that could help other people, including becoming a sobriety counselor and working at a treatment facility before returning to acting in Fuller House. She has also spoken about the frustration of having her entire identity reduced to the most difficult period of her life, especially when she was trying to re-establish herself professionally. Sweetin's concern was that the public sometimes treated recovery as her only story. Her position was not that the subject should disappear. She continued speaking about it, wrote about it, and worked in recovery-related settings. But she also wanted it understood as one part of a larger life that included acting, motherhood, advocacy, directing, comedy, and returning to the role that had first made her recognizable. Stamos's public timeline followed a different path. He has said that a 2015 DUI became the moment when he realized his drinking could not continue. He later entered rehabilitation and has described sobriety as something that required him to remain aware of where his earlier behavior had taken him. In interviews surrounding his 2023 memoir, If You Would Have Told Me, he also credited his family and the responsibilities waiting for him with helping him remain on that path. But 4 years after that turning point, Stamos publicly identified Sweetin as one of the people who had helped him. At the 2019 Experience, Strength and Hope Awards in Los Angeles, Stamos presented Sweetin with an award recognizing unSweetined and her recovery advocacy. Reporting from the event described an emotional introduction in which he credited her with supporting him after his 2015 arrest and during the period when he was getting sober. That ceremony is central to the new interview because it provides public evidence that their connection was not simply general cast friendship. Recovery had become part of it. The significance of that moment worked in both directions. Sweetin was being honored for telling her story and helping other people, but the person presenting the award was someone who said her example had affected his own life. Years later, Sweetin now describes herself as grateful that she could demonstrate recovery through the way she lived rather than through pressure or lectures. The timeline also helps explain why her comments matter now. Viewers may associate Stamos with the older, more experienced role he played on television, while Sweetin was one of the children in the cast. Their recovery story complicates that familiar image. By 2019, the former child actor was the person being honored for hard-earned experience, while her television uncle was publicly acknowledging what he had learned from her. That does not erase the seriousness of either person's past. It also does not mean their journeys were identical. Sweetin's history extended across many years and included multiple substances, treatment, relapses, and public scrutiny. Stamos has described his own alcohol use, arrest, rehabilitation, and the work required to remain sober. Their common ground appears to be recognition, accountability, and the ability to celebrate progress without pretending that recovery followed one simple path. Their relationship has remained publicly active outside this subject as well. In March 2026, Sweetin and Stamos reunited for a health awareness campaign built around their familiar uncle and niece dynamic. That project was unrelated to sobriety, but it offered recent confirmation that they were still comfortable working together and drawing on the connection audiences first saw during Full House. That recent reunion also changes how the July interview can be viewed. This is not a story in which two former colleagues have been separated for years and are suddenly revealing an old secret. They have continued appearing together, celebrating one another publicly, and referring to their history with affection. The recovery comments add another layer to a relationship that has remained visible. What Sweetin has not revealed is equally important. She did not describe the exact conversations she and Stamos had, how often they discussed sobriety, whether they attended any programs together, or whether there was one specific day when her influence changed his decision-making. Stamos's own past statements established that she helped him, but the private mechanics of that support have not been made public. Any more detailed version would be speculation. There is also no public reason to turn this into a story about current danger. The latest comments describe continuing recovery and mutual support. They should not be reframed as evidence that either person is presently struggling, and they should not be used to diagnose their private lives. The start line takeaway is that the new interview does not introduce a sudden reversal. It clarifies a relationship. Sweetin and Stamos were connected first by a television series, later by its revival, and eventually by the recognition that both had faced destructive behavior away from the cameras. What changed publicly is that Sweetin has now explained how she views that connection, not as one person saving the other, but as two people witnessing each other's milestones and demonstrating what sustained change could look like. The timing also matters because Sweetin has spent recent years reclaiming ownership of her story. She narrated a new version of her memoir, continued discussing the parts of recovery that are not easily condensed into a headline, and pushed back against being treated only as a former child star with a troubled past. Her latest comments place the emphasis somewhere different. Instead of returning to the most painful details, she focused on the person she became and the relationships that survived long enough to recognize that change. As of July 18, 2026, the clearest verified update is this. Sweetin says her last drink was in 2011. Stamos has publicly placed his sobriety turning point in 2015, and both have credited their relationship with providing meaningful support. The 2019 award ceremony remains the most visible moment demonstrating that connection, while the latest interview explains the principle Sweetin believes was operating behind it. No later public development, overturning or materially changing that account, was located after the interview coverage appeared. The unresolved part is not whether their bond continued beyond Full House. The public record shows that it did. The unanswered question is how many important conversations and quiet moments of support took place away from cameras, and how much of that story Sweetin and Stamos may ultimately decide should remain private.